Today we have some more actual history about the tragedy that befell the Oatman family as they traveled west to Arizona in late 1850 and early 1851. We will be continuing our series on this channel based on this book, Captivity of the Oatman Girls by Royal B. Stratton. This book was published all the way back in 1857. In today's episode, we pick up with the Oatman family right after they were frightened by an interaction with the Comanches. We will hear about how the Oatman family gradually fell out with the rest of the wagon train due to dissension and conflict. This book by Methodist minister Royal B. Stratton does not discuss it, but the Oatmans had converted from Methodism to Mormonism in 1839. But they had followed a different Mormon leader than Brigham Young following Joseph Smith's death in 1844, a self-described prophet named James Brewster. It was Brewster who organized this party in order to immigrate to what he called the land of Bashan, which is where the Gila and Colorado rivers meet, right at the border of Arizona and California, and the Oatmans had joined this train. We will now hear about what happened to this party as they experienced continued hardships on their journey west. While at camp on the river, one very tragical event occurred, which must not be omitted. One Mr. M.A.M. June had stepped down to the riverbank leisurely whistling along his way, in quest of a favorable place to draw upon the Arkansas for a pail of water. Suddenly 2 small girls who had been a little absent from camp, with aprons upon their head, rose above a little mound and presented themselves to his view. His busy brain must have been preoccupied with engines, for he soon came running, puffing, and yelling into camp. As he went headlong over the wagon tongue, his tin pail as it rolled, starting a half-score of dogs to their feet, and setting them upon a yell, he lustily and at the topmost pitch of his voice cried, "Engines! Engines!" He soon recovered his wits, however, and the pleasant little lasses came into camp with a hearty laugh, that they had so unexpectedly been made the occasion of a rich piece of fun. From the river bend or crossing on to Morrow, the first settlement we reached in New Mexico, was about 500 miles. During this time, nothing of special interest occurred to break the almost painful monotony of our way, or ruffle the quiet of our sociale, save an occasional family jar, the frequent crossing of pointed opinions, the now and then prophecies of engines ahead, etc., except one grape dumpling affair, which must be related by leaving a severe part untold. At one of our camps, on one of those fine watercourses that frequently set upon our way from the mountains, we suddenly found ourselves near neighbors to a bounteously burdened grape orchard. Of these we ate freely. One of our principal and physically talented matrons, however, like the distrustful Israelites, determined not to trust tomorrow for tomorrow's manna. She accordingly laid in a more than night's supply. The oversupply was, for safekeeping, done up brown in the form of well-prepared and thoroughly cooked dumplings, and these deposited in a cellar-like stern at the end of the big wagon. Unfortunate woman, if she had only performed these hiding ceremonies when the lank eye of one of our invalids, Mr. A.P., had been turned the other way, she might have prevented a calamity, kindred to that which befell the ancient emigrants when they sought to lay by more than was demanded by immediate wants. Now this A.P. had started out sick, and since his restoration had been constantly beleaguered by one of those dubious blessings, common as vultures upon the plains, a voracious appetite, an appetite that, like the grave, was constantly receiving, yet never found a place to say enough. Slowly he crawled from his bed, after he was sure that sleep had made Mrs. M. oblivious of her darling dumplings, and the rest of the camp unheedful of his movements, and standing at the stern of the wagon, he deliberately emptied almost the entire contents of this huge dumpling pan into his ever-craving interior. It seems that they had been safely stored in the wagon by this provident matron, to furnish a feast for the passengers when their travels might be along some grapeless waste, and but for the unnatural cravings of the unregulated appetite of A.P., might still have remained for that purpose. It was evident the next day that the invalid had been indulging in undue gluttony. He was sick again. Madam M. now seized a stake, and thoroughly caned him throughout the camp. After crossing the big desert one day while traveling, some of our company had their notions of our personal safety suddenly revolutionized under the following circumstances. A Mr. J. Thompson and a young man, C.M., had gone one side of the road some distance, hunting antelope. They went among the hills, and when they were some distance in advance of the camp, they came upon a large drove of antelopes. They were ignorant at the time of their whereabouts, and the routed game started directly toward the train. But to the hunters, the train seemed to be directly in the opposite direction. In the chase, the antelopes soon came in sight of the train, and several little girls and boys, seeing them, and seeing their pursuers, ran upon a slight elevation to frighten the antelopes back upon the hunters. Whereupon, by some unaccountable mirage deception, these little girls and boys were suddenly transformed into huge Indians to the eyes of the hunters. They were at once forgetful of their anticipated game, and regarding themselves as set upon by a band of some giant race, began to devise their own escape. Mr. T, thinking that no mortal arm could rescue them, turned at once and with much perturbation to the young man, and vehemently cried out, "Charles, let us pray!" Said Charles, "No, I'll be dead if I'll pray. Let us run." And at this time he tried the valor of running. All the exhortations of the old man to Charles to drop his gun were as fruitless as his entreaties to prayer. But when Mr. T saw that Charles was making such a rapid escape, he dropped his notions of praying, and took up the pursuit to the path left by the running but unpraying Charles. He soon outstripped the young man, and made him beg most lustily of the old man to wait and not run away and leave him there with the Injuns alone. The chagrin of the brave hunters, after they had reached camp by a long and circuitous route, may well be imagined when they found that they had been running from their own children, and that their fright and the running and fatigue it had cost them had been well understood by those of the camp who had been the innocent occasion of their chase for antelopes, suddenly being changed into a flight from Injuns. When we came into the Mexican settlements, our store of meats was well nigh exhausted, and we were gratefully surprised to find that at every stopping place abundance of mutton was in market, fresh and of superior quality, and to be purchased at low rates. This constituted our principal article of subsistence during the time we were traversing several hundred miles in this region. Slowly, but with unmistakable indications of a melancholy character, disaffection and disorder crept into our camp. Disagreements had occurred among families. Those who had taken the lead in originating the project had fallen under the ban and censure of those who, having passed the novelty of the trip, were beginning to feel the pressure of its dark, unwelcome, and anticipated realities. And in some instances a conduct was exhibited by those whose years and rank, as well as professions made at the outset, created expectation and confidence that in them would be found benefactors and wise counselors, that tended to disgrace their position, expose the unworthiness of their motives, and blast the bright future that seemed to hang over the first steps of our journeyings. As a consequence, feelings of discord were engendered, which gained strength by unwise and injudicious counsels, until their pestilential effects spread throughout the camp. At Moro we tarried one night. This is a small Mexican town of about 300 inhabitants, containing as the only objects of interest a Catholic mission station now in a dilapidated state, a fort well garrisoned by Mexican soldiers, and a fine stream of water that comes cool and clear bounding down the mountainside, beautifying and reviving this finely located village. The next day after leaving this place we came to the Natural or Santa Fe Pass, and camped that night at the well-known place called the Forks. From this point there is one road leading in a more southerly direction, and frequently selected by immigrants after arriving at the Forks, though the other road is said, by those best acquainted, to possess many advantages. At this place we found that the disaffection which had appeared for some time before was growing more and more incurable, and it began to break out into a general storm. Several of our number resolved upon taking the south road, but this resolution was reached only as a means of separating themselves from the remainder of the train, for the intention really was to become detached from the restraints and counsels that they found interfering with their uncontrollable selfishness. There seemed to be no possible method by which these disturbing elements could be quelled. The matter gave rise to an earnest consultation and discussion upon the part of the sober and prudent portion of our little band, but all means and measures prepared for an amicable adjustment of variances and divisions seemed powerless when brought in contact with the unmitigated selfishness that, among a certain few, had blotted out from their view the one object and system of regulation that they had been instrumental in throwing around the undertaking at first. We now saw a sad illustration of the adage that it is not all gold that glitters. The novelty of the scene, together with every facility for personal comfort and enjoyment, may suffice to spread the glad light of good cheer about the first few days or weeks of an emigrating tour upon these dreary plains. But let its pathway be found among hostile tribes for a number of weeks. Let a scarcity of provisions be felt. Let the teams begin to fail, with no time or pasturage to recruit them. Let inclement weather and swollen streams begin to hedge up the way. These and more that frequently becomes a dreadful reality have at once a wonderful power to turn every man into a kingdom by himself, and to develop the real nature of the most hidden motives of his being. Several of those who had, with unwonted diligence and forbearance, sought to restore quiet and satisfaction, but to no purpose, resolved upon remaining here until the disaffected portion had selected the direction and order of their own movements, and then quietly pursue their way westward by the other routes. After some delay and much disagreeable discussion among themselves, the northern route was selected by the malcontents, and they commenced their travels apart. The remainder of us started upon the south road, and though our animals were greatly reduced, our social condition was greatly improved. We journeyed on pleasantly for about 100 miles, when we reached Socorro, a beautiful and somewhat thrifty Mexican settlement. Our teams were now considerably jaded, and we found it necessary to make frequent halts and tarryings for the purpose of recruiting them, and this we found it the more difficult to do, as we were reaching a season of the year and section of the country that furnished a scanty supply of feed. We spent 1 week at Socorro for the purpose of rest to ourselves and our teams, as also to replenish, if possible, our fast diminishing store of supplies. We found that food was becoming more scarce among the settlements that lay along our line of travel, that quality and price were likewise serious difficulties, and that our wherewith to purchase even these was well nigh exhausted. We journeyed from Socorro to the Rio Grande, amid many and disheartening embarrassments and troubles. Sections of the country were almost barren, teams were failing, and indications of hostility among the tribes of Indians, representatives of whom frequently gave us the most unwelcome greetings, were becoming more frequent and alarming. Just before reaching the Rio Grande, 2 fine horses were stolen from Mr. Oatman. We afterward learned that they had been soon after seen among the Mexicans, though by them the theft was attributed to unfriendly neighboring tribes, and it was asserted that horses stolen from trains of emigrants were frequently brought into Mexican settlements and offered for sale. It is proper here to apprise the reader that the project of a settlement in New Mexico had now been entirely abandoned since the division mentioned above, and that California had become the place where we looked for a termination of our travel, and the land where we hoped soon to reach and find a home. At the Rio Grande we rested our teams 1 week, as a matter of necessary mercy, for every day we tarried was only increasing the probability of the exhaustion of our provisions, ere we could reach a place of permanent supply. We took from this point the Cook and Kearney route, and found the grass for our teams for a while, more plentiful than for hundreds of miles previous. Our train now consisted of 8 wagons and 20 persons. We now came into a mountainous country, and we found the frequent and severe ascents and declivities wearing upon our teams beyond any of our previous travel. We often consumed whole days in making less than a quarter of the usual day's advance. A few days after leaving the Rio Grande, one Mr. Lane died of the mountain fever. He was a man highly esteemed among the members of the train, and we felt his loss severely. We dug a grave upon one of the foothills, and with appropriate funeral obsequies we lowered his remains into the same. Some of the female members of our company planted a flower upon the mounds that lifted itself over his lonely grave. A rude stake with his name and date of death inscribed upon it was all we left to mark the spot of his last resting place. One morning, after spending a cool night in a bleak and barren place, we awoke with several inches of snow lying about us upon the hills in the distance. We had spent the night and a part of the previous day without water. Our stock were scattered during the night, and our first object after looking them up was to find some friendly place where we might slake our thirst. The morning was cold, with a fierce, bleak wind setting in from the north. Added to the pains of thirst was the severity of the cold. We found that the weather is subject in this region to sudden changes from one to the other extreme. While in this distressed condition, some of our party espied in the distance a streak of timber letting down from the mountains, indicative of running living water. To go to this timber we immediately made preparation, with the greatest possible dispatch as our only resort, and our half-wavering expectations were more than realized, for after a most fatiguing trip of nearly a day, during which many of us were suffering severely from thirst, we reached the place, and found not only timber and water in abundance, but a plentiful supply of game. Turkeys, deer, antelope, and wild sheep were dancing through every part of the beautiful woodlands that lured us from our bleak mountain camp. As the weather continued extremely cold, we must have suffered severely, if we had not lost our lives even by the severity of the weather, as there was not a particle of anything with which to kindle a fire, unless we had used our wagon timber for that purpose, had we not sought the shelter of this friendly grove. We soon resolved upon at least 1 week's rest in this place, and arrangements were made accordingly. During the week we feasted upon the most excellent wild meats, and spent most of our time in hunting and fishing. Excepting the fear we constantly entertained concerning the Indians of the neighborhood, we spent the week here very pleasantly. One morning 3 large, fierce-looking Apaches came into camp at an early hour. They put on all possible pretensions of friendship, but from the first their movements were suspicious. They for a time surveyed narrowly our wagon and teams, and so far as allowed to do so, our articles of food, clothing, guns, etc. Suspecting their intentions, we bade them be off, upon which they reluctantly left our retreat. That night the dogs kept up a barking nearly the whole night, and at seasons of the night would run to their masters, and then a short distance into the wood, as if to warn us of the nearness of danger. We put out our fires, and each man with his arms kept vigilant guard. There is no doubt that by this means our lives were preserved. Tracks of a large number of Indians were seen near the camp next morning, and on going out we found that 20 head of stock had been driven away, some of which belonged to the teams. By this, several of our teams were so reduced that we found extreme difficulty in getting along. Some of our wagons and baggage were left at a short distance from this, in consequence of what we here lost. We traced the animals some distance, until we found the trail leading into the wild, difficult mountain fastnesses, where it was dangerous and useless to follow. We were soon gathered up and en route again for Tabac, another Mexican settlement, of which we had learned as presenting inducements for a short recruiting halt. We found ourselves again traveling through a rich pasturage country, abounding with the most enchanting, charming scenery that had greeted us since we had left the Big Bend. We came into Tabac with better spirits and more vigorous teams than was allowed during our last few hundred miles. At this place one of our number became the unwilling subject of a most remarkable and dampening transaction. Mrs. M, of grape dumpling notoriety, while bearing her 240 of avoirdupois about the camp at a rather too rapid rate, suddenly came in sight of a well that had been dug many years before by the Mexican settlers. While guiding her steps so as to shun this huge-looking hole, suddenly she felt old earth giving way beneath her. It proved that a well of more ancient date than the one she was seeking to shun had been dug directly in her way, but had accumulated a fine covering of grass during the lapse of years. The members of the camp who were lazily whiling away the hours on the downhill side of the well's mouth were soon apprised of the fact that some momentous cause had interfered with nature's laws, and opened some new and hitherto unseen fountains in her bosom. With the sudden disappearance of Mrs. M, there came a large current of clear, cold water flowing through the camp, greatly dampening our joys, and starting us upon the alert to inquire into the cause of this strange phenomenon. Mrs. M we soon found safely lodged in the old well, but perfectly secure, as the water, on the principle that 2 bodies cannot occupy the same space at the same time, had leaped out as Mrs. M's mammoth proportions had suddenly laid an imperative possessory injunction upon the entire dimensions of the hole in the ground. We found after leaving Tabac the road uneven, the rains had set in, the nights were cold, and evidences of the constant nearness and evil designs of savage tribes were manifested every few miles that we passed over. Several once rich but now evacuated Mexican towns were passed, from which the rightful owners of the soil had been driven by the Apaches. At Santa Cruz we found a Mexican settlement of about 100 inhabitants, friendly and rejoiced to see us come among them, as they were living constantly in fear of the implacable Apaches, whose depredations were frequent and of most daring and outrageous character. Almost every day, bands of these miscreant wretches were in sight upon the surrounding hills, waiting favorable opportunities for the perpetration of deeds of plunder and death. They would at times appear near to the Mexican herdsmen, and tauntingly command them to herd and take care of those cattle for the Apaches. We found the country rich and desirable, but for its being infested by these desperadoes. We learned, both from the Mexicans and the conduct of the Indians themselves, that one American placed them under more dread and fear than a score of Mexicans. By the friendliness and generosity of the settlers at this point, we made a fine recruit while tarrying there. For a while we entertained the project of remaining for a year. Probably had it not been for the prowling Indians, whose thieving, murdering banditti infest field and woodlands, we might have entered into negotiations with the Mexicans to this effect. But we were now en route for the Eureka of the Pacific slope, and we thought we had no time to waste between us and the realization of our golden dreams. Every inducement that fear and generosity could invent, and that was in the power of these Mexicans to control, was however presented and urged in favor of our taking up a residence among them. But we had no certainty that our small number, though of the race most their dread, would be sufficient to warrant us in the successful cultivation of the rich and improved soil that was proffered us. Nothing but a constant guard of the most vigilant kind could promise any safety to fields of grain or herds of cattle. We next, at about 80 miles from Santa Cruz, came to Tucson, another larger town than Santa Cruz, and more pleasantly as well as more securely situated. Here again the same propositions were renewed, as had been plied so vehemently at the last stopping place. Such were the advantages that our host held out for the raising of a crop of grain, and fattening our cattle, that some of our party immediately resolved upon at least 1 year's stay. The whole train halted here 1 month. During that time, those of our party who could not be prevailed upon to proceed had arrangements made and operations commenced for a year of agricultural and farming employment. At the end of 1 month, the family of Wilders, Kellys, and ourselves started. We urged on amid multiplying difficulties for several days. Our provisions had been but poorly replenished at the last place, as the whole of their crops had been destroyed by their one common and relentless foe during the year. With all their generosity, it was out of their power to aid us as much as they would have done. Frequently after this, for several nights, we were awakened to arm ourselves against the approaching Apaches, who hung in front and rear of our camp for nights and days. Wearied, heartsick, and nearly destitute, we arrived at the Pimo village, on or about the 16th of February, 1851. Here we found a settlement of Indians who were in open hostility to the Apaches, and by whose skill and disciplined strength they were kept from pushing their depredations further in that direction. But so long had open and active hostilities been kept up that they were short of provisions and in nearly a destitute situation. They had been wont to turn their attention and energies considerably to farming, but during the last 2 years their habits in this respect had been greatly interfered with. We found the 90 miles that divides Tucson from Pomole to be the most dismal, desolate, and unfruitful of all the regions over which our way had led us yet. Poor and desolate as were the war-hunted Pomoles, and unpromising as seemed every project surveyed by our anxious eyes for relief, and a supply for our almost drained stores of provisions, yet it was soon apparent to our family that if we would proceed further we must venture the journey alone. Soon, and after a brief consultation, a full resolution was reached by the Wilders and Kellys to remain, and stake their existence upon traffic with the Pomoles, or upon a sufficient tarrying to produce for themselves, until from government or friends they might be supplied with sufficient to reach Fort Yuma. To Mr. Oatman this resolution brought a trial of a darker hue than any that had cast its shadows upon him as yet. He believed that starvation or the hand of the treacherous savage would soon bring them to an awful fate if they tarried, and with much reluctance he resolved to proceed, with no attendants or companions, save his exposed and depressed family. So that's it for this episode from this 1857 book by Royal B. Stratton. The Oatmans are now about to proceed further west all by themselves. We will hear what happens to them in the next episode on this channel. I am now going to read this short section from the Texas State Historical Association's page on Olive Oatman. This tells about the religious background of the Oatman family and presents a different side of Mr. Oatman than that presented in Royal Stratton's book. The Oatman family gave up their Methodist faith in about 1839 to become followers of Joseph Smith, founder of the religious group called Mormons, but officially designated as the Latter-day Saints, or Saints of the Latter Days. Following Smith's death at the hands of a mob in 1844, the Oatmans rejected the leadership of Brigham Young and joined a dissident group of Mormons led by a self-designated seer and revelator named James Colin Brewster. Brewster had received revelations that the true gathering place of the Mormons was to be at the confluence of the Gila and Colorado rivers, now located on the border between Arizona and California, in what he identified as the land of Bashan. Leaving Illinois, the Oatmans joined a wagon trains of Brewsterites that left Independence, Missouri in August 1850, and headed for the land of Bashan. Royce Oatman proved to be a difficult and quarrelsome traveling partner, so other members of the train gradually separated themselves from him and his family as they made their way along the Santa Fe Trail through Kansas and New Mexico, the northern reaches of the Mexican state of Sonora, and what would soon, through the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, become southern Arizona. So that's it for this episode. Here we heard two different accounts as to why the Oatman family ended up alone as they tried to reach California through southwestern Arizona in 1851. In Royal Stratton's book, which was written with Lorenzo and Olive Oatman, the rest of the members were said to have left because they were selfish and would not listen to prudent instruction, while this account from the Texas State Historical Association says that Royce Oatman was a difficult and quarrelsome traveling partner. Let us know what you think in the comments. Another question we might ask Royce Oatman is why he took his family alone after the rest of their party stayed at the Pima village. Was that a good idea when they had seen so many signs of hostile Indians? In the next episode on this channel, we will hear about what resulted from Mr. Oatman's decision, as his family attempts to complete the last stretch of their journey to California. This is when tragedy will really set in for the Oatman family. This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has now been deemed unworthy to discuss on history channels on TV. Here on this channel, we keep this worthy history alive by reading directly from old books. If you'd like to support the mission of this channel, then you can join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member. Members will have full access to all of our members-only videos, and your contribution towards keeping actual history alive will be recognized at the end of each episode. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.